Okay, so I got one super important question. How do you say this word? Is it Nostale, Nostale, Nustale? What is it? I'm just gonna go with Nostale. Nostale is a free-to-play anime MMORPG that released all the way back in Korea in 2006, with the global version eventually coming out some years later. Developed and published by Entwell Corporation Limited in Korea and published by Gameforge here in the West, Nostale embodies the early Korean free-to-play anime MMORPGs that flooded the market during the mid-2000s. When it released, it was going against other free-to-play MMORPG titles like MapleStory, Flyff, Rose, and a relatively popular one overseas during this era being Ragnorak Online. In fact, when you look at how Nostale plays, it looks and feels a lot like Ragnorak Online, which depending on if you are a fan of Ragnarok, might be pretty appealing. However, nowadays in 2025, I think it's pretty obvious that Nostale is a game that most of you have probably never even heard of. With the game being a few years shy of being 20 years old, is the game worth checking out in the modern era of MMORPGs? Is this a diamond in the rough that all of us have been missing out on?
Anything's possible! Anything's possible!
Let's check it out. So unlike some other games I've covered, Nostale is pretty easy to sign up for and jump into. You can either go to the Gameforge website, download their launcher, and install the game there, or grab the game from Steam, which requires a lot less steps. However you install the game, once you get logged in, you are greeted with the server selection screen. Server selection is pretty much dependent on what language you speak, as the game supports English, German, French, Italian, Polish, and Spanish, with some languages getting their own server, and others sharing a central server. I chose the international server Valahur personally, but most players will recommend you play on Dragonvale as that has a lot more players on it. Once you select a server, you are brought to the character creation screen. Character creation is rather simple with barely any options at all. You can choose between either being male or female, you get 2 hair options, hair colors, and that's it. No skin color options, eye looks or eye colors, outfit options. Nope, just 3 choices and your name. You can't even choose a class, but that's because everyone starts out as an adventurer when they begin. Once you've created your character and log in, you are treated with the intro cutscene that sets up the story. The beginning storyline is essentially you are an adventurer who has been tasked with helping end the situation between the people of Nostale and the rebelling kobolds following the potential resurrection of the Tree of Fernin, which apparently is going to cause all kinds of trouble. Now obviously there is more that unravels throughout the main storyline quest, but like many early anime MMORPGs, the storyline is completely ignorable. Getting into the game, you'll find that the graphics have a very dated look with characters and enemies being represented with 2D sprites on a 3D plane. Characters have decent details and life to them, but I can't help but notice how characters have this odd frame issue. Basically, characters only have a few frames of animations to them, leading to this juddery look as you play. It's odd because certain things you do look fine, like when you walk, but other animations only have 1 or 2 frames of reference. It just looks weird, but admittedly, it's something you do get used to. The world itself is colorful and bright, but has relatively low resolution textures. Honestly, this is to be expected though, considering the game is nearly 20 years old at this point. Sound effects are sort of hit and miss, with some either sounding too loud or too quiet. In contrast, the music of Nostale is actually pretty catchy, with tunes having a really upbeat tone, giving feelings of adventure like the Plains theme, or having a sense of danger and intensity like the Dungeons or Mine theme. Getting back to the intro, the game pushes you to do the main storyline quest, which acts as a pseudo-tutorial. It will teach you all the basics of Nostale, including movement, combat, features, and progression. Let's start with the game's combat. Combat in Nostale is basically a point-and-click affair where double-clicking on an enemy will have your character start attacking it. From here, you can use any abilities that you have slotted into your hotbar. In the meantime, your character will auto-attack until you or the enemy is defeated, and that's basically all there is to it. One big drawback to the game's combat though is just how stiff it is. Auto-attacking is relatively fine, even though it's slow, but the main gripe I have is with using abilities and spells. Whenever you press the hotkey to use a specific ability, it takes the game a second or more for it to actually fire off. This can lead to some frustrating combat situations where you are desperately trying to use abilities, but it just takes your character too long to do them. It feels really silly that combat spells and abilities have such a delay like that, considering, like I said, the combat is very simple otherwise, and it's not like potions take forever to use. Another annoyance is targeting. When there is a ton of enemies all clumped together in a small amount of space, it's really hard to target specific enemies that you are trying to attack. Look at some of the footage here where there are mobs of enemies. I can't tell what's hitting me, what specific enemy I'm hitting. It's just a big mess. Typically, I just click enemies, use abilities from my hotbar, and hope for the best. And like I said, for the most part, luckily, the combat is pretty simple. Now, there are some mechanics at hand, like having to move away from indicated spots from enemies to avoid damage, but usually that shows up in raid encounters. In the beginning, you'll most likely just be pointing and clicking to attack enemies, but once you hit level 20, you can choose a class that will help shake up how you interact with combat. As stated before, you start out as an adventurer at level 1, and when you get to level 20, you can either become a swordsman, an archer, or a sorcerer. Advanced classes can be unlocked and swapped to starting at level 36, but we'll get to that one in a bit. The main gameplay loop you'll have in the beginning, besides combat, will be completing the main story quest. Quests consist of collecting specific enemy drops, completing dungeons, or killing enemies, which is your standard quest structure, with nothing really all that unique here. As you complete these quests, you'll level up, with each level giving you a small boost to your stats. You'll also earn equipment, which also increases your combat power. And a neat little feature that Nostale introduces rather quickly is getting AI party members in the form of Nosmates and partners. Nosmates are this game's pet system, and it's probably one of the more robust pet systems I've seen in an MMORPG. Basically, almost every enemy you encounter can be tamed and used as a pet that will help you in combat. Each pet has their own stats, skills, and levels that can make them unique from one another. Partners are another AI party member you can earn in the game that can be further customized with equipment, items, and even their own unique classes. Since at minimum you'll have at least a pet and a partner helping you in combat, the game is pretty solo friendly, and if you really want to, you can spend a ton of time customizing and powering up your pets and partners. Dungeons are basically short mini quests where you'll move on a grid-based map similar to old school Legend of Zelda, where in each room you'll fight enemies, interact with switches, survive enemy waves, or have some other objective to complete. Many of these are copy and paste with a little variety, but I have to admit, these little bite-sized dungeons were pretty enjoyable, even if they were rather short. Now on the flip side, Nostale actually has full-fledged endgame raids that function similarly to these dungeons, just obviously much harder and geared to be played with other players. So if you are the type of player that wants to have endgame activities, there is definitely endgame content here, especially considering it takes quite a lot of effort to get to the endgame. Let's circle back around to progression real quick and talk about all the ways you can customize and power up your character. First is your character's base level, which maxes out at 99. Then you have your character's job level, champion level, and specialist cards. Job levels allow you to learn new abilities. Champion levels unlock at endgame and are basically further levels that unlock even more perks. Then finally, you have your specialist card. Each class has various specialists that can be unlocked at various base levels, and which ones you can unlock depends on the class you chose at level 20. These cards, however, take a resource called SP to maintain, making the advanced class feel almost like a limited super transformation of your base class. Within this system, there is basically over 30 class cards to choose from, upgrade, and play as, with a bonus base class that has their own cards, being the martial artist, that has to be unlocked by getting a character to level 80 and then creating a new character. The card system reminds me a lot of the job system from Final Fantasy XI and 14, since cards have to be unlocked via quests and other methods. Other features features in Nostale include player-owned housing, fishing, crafting, and PvP. Player-owned housing in Nostale, otherwise known as the Miniland, has a few benefits to players. First, it houses all of your pets and your partners, so teleporting here allows you to swap them out whenever you want. You can also decorate your Miniland with various decorations that you earn or craft. Lastly, you can harvest various resources in your Miniland once you've unlocked the ability to do so. Crafting in Nostale isn't really a feature, since it basically works off of NPCs. To craft, you have to go to visit a specific shop or have specific blueprints that allow you to craft various things. You also have the ability to enhance equipment with various stats and abilities using some of these NPCs. Of course, enhancements, much like other free-to-play MMORPGs from this era, have a chance of failing, which destroys your item unless you have something that protects it. We'll get to that soon enough. Gathering materials for crafting also doesn't have its own profession or level, so crafting is just simplified in Nostale overall. Professions sorta exist in Nostale in the form of special unique cards that don't really relate to combat. For example, fishing has its own dedicated content in the form of the fishing log, but it's tied to the fisherman card. The chef card allows you to cook special dishes, and the pet trainer card allows you to further power up your pets. However, most of these cards cannot be earned until level 80, unfortunately, which is a shame considering this side content would be great distractions for new players besides the main leveling grind. PvP surprisingly has more support and content in Nostale than I thought. Various events are ran at certain time intervals that anyone can join in on to PvP, with dedicated PvP like arenas, guild PvP, and open world PvP also being available. Community features are pretty standard. Like I said a moment ago, there is guilds in Nostale, aka families, that get access to various perks and content. There is also an auction house that allows you to buy items from other players very easily, as well as the option for player-owned shops in various areas. Unfortunately, World Chat, like MapleStory, is restricted to a cash shop item, meaning if you want to speak to other players reliably, you'll either need to buy them in the auction house from other players or pony up some real-life money. But luckily, the game does at least allow you to trade cash shop items, so theoretically, you can be completely free to play. Surprisingly though, the community for Nostale is actually a lot larger than I expected for such a niche game. During my time with it, I had no trouble finding people around. It's just unfortunately, most of the community in-game is completely quiet. This is where you more or less have to join the game's Discord to talk to anyone. The game's official Discord is a great resource for finding potential people to play with. Plus, it's a good way to avoid buying World Chat speakers. Okay, so let's talk about Nostale's monetization. Nostale is a completely free-to-play game with a cash shop. The cash shop has pretty much all the usual suspects here. It has convenience items, items that boost XP and resource gains, items that help boost your equipment, pets that are much better than the ones you can catch, cosmetics, loot boxes, mounts, quite a lot of things that will give players who spend money an advantage over those who don't. There are a few upsides here though. First off, many of the items purchased from the cash shop are tradable, so you can just earn some of these. Another is that some of the items in the cash shop are relatively cheap, with the most expensive thing I found being about 20 bucks. Now obviously that doesn't make things any better, but it's at least worth mentioning. Nostale is a retro throwback to older anime MMORPGs from the mid-2000s. It has charming character design, content that will appeal to casual and hardcore players, systems that reward those willing to grind, and a community that is larger than I think most would initially give the game credit for. Unfortunately, even with the game's positives, there is just as many negatives. The clunky combat, content locked behind nigh-end game levels, pay to win, and players multi-boxing, leading to a relatively quiet community, just to name a few things. Still, I think there is something special Nostale offers that keeps its hardcore player base coming back, and maybe with a video like this, it can still grab new players for years to come. Let's get to my final thoughts. Nostale at first glance is going to appeal to fans of old-school anime MMORPGs from the early to mid-2000s. Players who liked Ragnorak Online, MapleStory, or Flife will find fun in Nostale. The game has probably one of the most robust pet systems I've ever seen in an MMORPG. The fact that you can tame literally almost every monster you come across is insane, not to mention all the systems in place that allow you to power up and train your pets and companions. Now, it takes a while to get to the game's unlockable classes, but the fact that there is over 30 classes to play as is quite appealing for those who like class variety. I like the fact that Nostale has quite a lot of content that appeals to all sorts of players. Whether you like to be solo, with a party, engage in PvP, or just want to find new friends, Nostale has a little bit of everything. Lastly, the game has a relatively vocal development team that seems to take player feedback and still actively develops for the game. Now, the game doesn't necessarily get enormous content expansions or anything like that, at least not super often, but they do add things to the game that are new. Compare that to other MMORPGs from this era that rarely ever drop updates. It's good to see that Nostale at least gives players something new every now and then, which is great to see for players looking to jump in for the first time. Unfortunately, Nostale hasn't really aged the best in some aspects. For one, the combat is really stiff and clunky in my opinion. Abilities have this weird wind-up time compared to other tasks that fire up immediately. It gets even worse when there are a ton of enemies all clumped together, wailing on you and stunning you. It can be a frustrating mess. Sadly, like some of the other older MMORPGs I've covered on the channel, a lot of the cooler content doesn't unlock until you are a much higher level. It's a hard ask for a new player to stick around until those higher levels to do anything besides dungeons and grind monsters. Why is the fishing, pet tamer, or chef specialist locked until level 80? Why is the additional player-owned housing features locked until you gain enough reputation, or like the other things, locked until you are a much higher level? New players want to engage in other activities besides fighting monsters. It's a shame that nearly everything you are pushed towards in the beginning is just story quests with nothing in between. Another unfortunate design Nostale takes from early free-to-play MMORPGs is the heavy amount of pay-to-win in its cash shop. From pets that are fundamentally better than the defaults you find, to items that literally improve your stats, it's easy to see that players who spend money have an advantage. And finally, to wrap things up, Nostale has a really rough early game that unfortunately probably isn't hooking in new potential players. When I started, things were quite fun until the game stopped giving clear explanations or just randomly spiked in difficulty. I had to constantly reference guides online to find where quests were given or how to engage with a specific mechanic. To be fair, the game does try to explain its systems, and honestly, I'm not against game design that encourages you to explore, but Nostale just felt really unintuitive at points for no reason. If you are a new player, I recommend at least finding a family to join or follow a guide. Otherwise, expect to run into frustrating problems as you try to power through the game's early levels. Man, as I look into more of these older MMORPGs, it's crazy to think that some of these, like Nostale, are still trucking along nearly 20 years later. Of course, the major question nowadays is, will the game survive another 20 years or so? Obviously, all good things must come to an end, but in Nostale's case, if they could streamline some of the game's systems, improve the feel of combat, and retain their current passionate player base, I don't see why the game wouldn't have a bright future. Anyways, what do you think of Nostale? Do you play it? Let me know down in the comments section below. Don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel to support my content. Follow all my social media links in the description below, and I hope to see you all next time.